Warp stabilizer and rolling shutter repair can be found under the distort category, and camera shake deblur is found under the blur and sharpen category, but they all can work together to help you improve the quality of footage that was shot either with shaky hands or had motion blur to it, or for removing rolling shutter, which happens on basically any camera that you use today. Now, if you only want to know about one of these three effects, just jump to that chapter in this video, but I'm going to start with warp stabilizer because it's the most complicated and you actually need to stabilize footage before using camera shake deblur. So I took this video clip with my camera and I purposely disabled the built-in stabilization so that it's a little bit shakier than normal, and I gave my hand a little bit of an artificial shake just to exaggerate it a bit. But this is exactly the kind of footage that's perfect for using the warp stabilizer effect to smooth out. So I'm going to bring that out. Again, it's under the distort category. Just drag it right out on top of my footage, and immediately After Effects is going to give me this banner letting me know that it's analyzing in the background, and there's a progress right here. So it's letting me know what frame it's on and how many frames there are. Once it's done, it switches to actually stabilizing that footage, and there we go. Just like that, it's completely analyzed the clip and applied stabilization to it using the default settings. So let's play this back and see what it looks like. Much smoother. Now, there obviously is some warping going on and there is some blur showing up. And that blur is because even though it's able to stabilize the footage, it's not able to completely remove that motion blur. It's still there because that's baked into the clip. And stabilizing the footage doesn't remove blur. But just to show you how big of a difference this actually is, I'm gonna name this one stabilized, duplicate it, and call this original, remove that warp stabilizer effect, and then apply the linear wipe effect. Set it to 50%, and we can see now on the right side is the unstabilized or the original, and the left is the stabilized. Now play this back. And clearly the left is much smoother. Now, you'll also notice that it's a little bit cropped in, and that's just a natural side effect of how the stabilization process works. But if I go into the controls, we can actually disable that. If we go to the framing section and just change it to stabilize only instead of stabilize, crop, and auto scale, then we're going to see the edges of the frame and it's not going to be cropped in anymore. The only thing happening now is position, scale, rotation, and some distortion to keep the objects that are actually near the center of the frame nice and locked in place. And this is a great way to view exactly how the stabilization is taking place. Now, obviously, having that black border around the outside edges is probably not what you want. So why don't we look at the other framing options? We have stabilize and crop, which is going to prevent those edges from shifting around if that's the part you don't like. Or we could say stabilize, crop, and auto scale, so it'll just resize to fit the frame that it already was in. And it even tells us what that auto scale is. But if I twirl this down, I have even more control. I can set my maximum scale to anything I want. So if I didn't want this to be scaled more than 115%, I'll just type that number in, and now it won't scale beyond that. We are still gonna see those black bars, but it'll at least crop less of my image off. I was fine with where it was, so I'm gonna set that back to 150. The next property is action safe margin. If I turn this up or down, this is basically going to put a margin around the outside edge of the frame to say I need to see at least 5% all around the outside edge. And that's what they call an action safe margin. Finally, we have additional scale. So I could scale it in even further if I wanted to, or back it off. This is completely global. It's after these two other properties have been accounted for and just gives you more control. The last framing option is stabilize and synthesize edges. So this is going to attempt to actually generate pixels that weren't there before, filling in those edges instead of zooming in and cropping. It's going to take what was in those black bars and attempt to generate what it thinks should be there. Now, at the beginning of the clip, it can't do this because there's no information prior to this point for it to fill in this information with. It's kind of like content-aware fill, where it's guessing what should be there, but it doesn't work until it's gotten into that fully cropped frame. Then it's going to attempt to fill in those edges based on the frames coming after it and before it, instead of cropping it in. Now, this can be glitchy. Like you can see right up here, we've got some tearing, but I will again duplicate this and change this back to stabilize, crop, and auto scale to show you just how much of a difference there is. If I changed it to stabilize only, and turn the background off, you can see all of the frame that's being generated by that synthesized edges. So that can be a very useful technique for stabilization as long as you watch out for those glitches. Now let's jump back up to the stabilization category. This is where we can choose what kind of result we want. There's two options, smooth motion or no motion. Smooth motion is going to just take whatever movement is in your shot and attempt to smooth it out and make it look like it was shot on a Steadicam, basically. And we can change just how smooth that actually is. So if this is looking a little too smooth for you, a little too floaty, then you can turn this down to say 10%. It will have to restabilize, but once it's done, you can just play it back and see that now there's a little bit more movement, but it might look a little bit more natural and you might see less distortion. Or if you really want to go crazy, you could turn that way up high. The maximum is 1000, and let's just see what that looks like. We're actually getting an error. To avoid extreme cropping, set framing to stabilize only or adjust other parameters. This is the effects way of telling you that basically you're asking for way too much. That smoothness is way too high. So I could change this to stabilize only like it's suggesting, and then we can see what it's doing. If you look at the center of the frame, it's pretty much locked in place 100%, but the amount of smoothing that's happening is just really extreme. So maybe I want to go down to something like 200 instead, and I'll turn this back to stabilize, crop, and auto scale, and now it's just super, super smooth. But that comes with the trade-off of being a lot more cropped in. So I'm just going to reset that back down to its default of 50. And then the next option is method. This is how it's actually stabilizing. Subspace warp is the default, and this is going to give you really smooth results. This allows the effect to manipulate and distort different parts of the frame, however it thinks it needs to keep things in perspective and looking as good as possible. This is actually something that happens with stabilization footage shot on a smartphone. If I had left the stabilization on, then the footage would probably look pretty similar to what this is, again with the trade-off of cropping in on the footage. Your phone is actually cropping your phone sensor when you have that stabilization enabled. But we have other options. Let's just go to the first one, which is position only. This is just going to shift my frame around and do nothing else to try and stabilize it. Let's turn this back to stabilize only so we can see this clearly. Our frame is literally just being moved around, and this is something that was a lot more difficult to do with the actual tracker built in After Effects, where you'd have to find a point to track, which was a very slow process, and then you could apply the same kind of transformation where it's just shifting your layer around. This effect does it in a matter of seconds. It's a much better solution. But we don't only have to use position, we could also use scale and rotation, so that it's not only accounting for up and down and left and right motion of the camera, but also any rotation and moving in and out. It can rotate and scale the frame as well, and that produces a much smoother result. Those first two options, though, don't actually distort your image in any way. It's just transforming those three properties. Perspective is going to introduce some actual distortion, and we can see it right here. See how these frames are no longer perfectly square? It's actually distorting the frame to help counteract that shift in movement while I was filming. And with both perspective and position, scale, and rotation, we have this checkbox that's enabled called Preserve Scale. And what this is going to do is prevent the stabilizer from trying to correct basically forward and backward movement, in and out, or the Z-axis, leaving that scale untouched. And then finally, we have the subspace warp, which we've already looked at, which in addition to adjusting the position, scale, and rotation, and even the perspective, allows the image to be distorted a little bit more freely, however the effect thinks it should be, to produce the most stable result. Now, I've prepared this other clip to show you what no motion would look like. If I apply that warp stabilizer effect to it, what I've done on this clip is just tried to hold as still as possible. And any of this back and forth movement that you're seeing was just a result of me not being able to hold perfectly still. This is a really small toy, so obviously the camera movements are pretty exaggerated this close in. But if I change the result from smooth motion to no motion, what it's going to attempt to do is remove all of the camera movement. And I'll play this back to show that basically everything is locked in place now. There still is some movement because I was so close to the subject. That shift in perspective between the foreground and the background is really noticeable. But imagine you were maybe taking a video of the mountains or something far away, and you just didn't have a tripod. You're trying to hold the camera still, but you have some natural hand movement. Warp stabilizer set to no motion is going to give you that really smooth result. But we still have all these extra controls for the method, as well as preserving the scale, to allow you to customize how this is handling it. You can think of smooth motion like trying to just smooth out the camera movement that's happening, and no motion as a way to try and counteract any slight camera movement when really you should have been using a tripod in the first place. All right, that's it for stabilization and borders. I'm going to switch this back to stabilize, crop, and auto scale, and then collapse these two up. And then we have this advanced category. Now, this is where we can turn on the detailed analysis, which could produce better results. So I'm going to, again, duplicate this, and I'll rename this detailed, turn off the original, check that box on, and again, allow it to analyze in the background. This will be a little bit slower than before, but as you can see, it's still fairly quick. So what this effect is actually doing during that analysis phase is finding points to track in your image to pull data from and attempt to use to stabilize the footage after the fact. Checking on detailed analysis is going to let the effect look at more tracking points, which is why it takes longer and it's slower to update. But like I said, it can produce a better result. So let's apply that linear wipe one more time, turn it to 50%, so we're on the right side now, turn the standard stabilized footage back on, that'll be on the left, and play this back. So there is a difference, and whether or not it's a better difference is completely subjective. You need to decide which works better for you, if it's actually giving you a better result and worth that longer time. It really just depends on the shot and what the resulting stabilized footage actually looks like. All right, I'm going to turn the original back off again and get rid of that linear wipe, and we'll look at the other controls. This fast analysis checkbox was implemented at the end of 2020, and it's literally just Adobe improving the effect and making it work faster. The reason it's here as a checkbox is just in case it produces results that you're not happy with, you can uncheck it to revert back to the original way. But I haven't seen any issues with it, so I always leave that checked. Next is rolling shutter ripple. And this is actually attempting to do the exact same thing that the rolling shutter repair effect does, built right into Warp Stabilizer, but it only really shows up on footage that's whipping back and forth with the camera panning left and right, so this clip doesn't actually show it. If I jump over to this comp just for a second, right here, you see that the box is being distorted. The top of the frame is moving before the bottom of the frame. That's rolling shutter, and that's what this can deal with. So in addition to tracking and stabilizing your footage, it's able to reduce that distortion as well. You can change it from automatic reduction to enhanced reduction. Again, this is just a quality setting. It will take a little bit longer to do, but it might produce better results. It won't make a difference in this clip though, since I don't really have any. This next property is crop less or smooth. And this is just one of those advanced settings where you can control the trade-off between cropping your frame less or smoothing more. So if I dial this back, eventually I'm going to start to see less cropping. It'll be a little less smooth now. In fact, there's quite a bit more shakiness, but we're cropping less of the frame. So it's kind of like a tolerance slider for how much it's cropping or how smooth it's making the footage. If I turn that all the way up to 100, we're going to get very smooth footage, but it's cropping in quite a bit more. I'll change that back to 50%. And these three options right here are grayed out because synthesis was disabled. If I go back to my borders and change this to stabilize and synthesize edges, then those options will become available to me, and it allows me to control a little bit about how those edges are being synthesized. First is the synthesis input range, which is measured in seconds. So this is how far forward and backwards it's looking in time to pull data for those edges that are being synthesized. We also have synthesis edge feather. So if I find a point where I'm seeing a little bit of a glitch on that synthesized edge, and now that I'm using the detailed analysis, we're not getting too much of that glitching out. But if I go to a point, say right about here, right at the top, you can see this tearing that's happening. And I turn up that synthesized edge feather, then it's going to attempt to feather that out, smooth it together with the original footage to get something that's just a little less glitchy. We also have synthesis edge cropping options, so I could turn the crop up on any one of these edges, and it will shift that edge downwards before generating those extra pixels. I'm going to turn that border back to just stabilize, crop, and auto rotate. And I'm going to turn detailed analysis off just so it goes a little bit more quickly now. And the next option is objective. This is what we're telling the effect we actually want it to do. Our main objective currently is to stabilize, but we could also do one of these four options: reversible stabilization, reverse stabilization, apply motion to target, and apply motion to target over original. So why would we want to do any of this? Well, the reason there's a divider is because by default, the thing you're probably trying to do is just stabilize footage. Well, let's say you wanted to apply an effect to this footage, but you wanted it to appear to be affected by the camera shake. That's exactly what these are for. Reversible stabilization and reverse stabilization are meant to be used together, and you need multiple instances of Warp Stabilizer to do it. So for this one, I'm going to set it to reversible stabilization, It'll have to reanalyze, but it doesn't take all that long to do. And now we have this really cropped in version of our footage. Then I'm going to duplicate the effect, collapse the first one, and change this to reverse stabilization. And we're actually back to our original footage. This is exactly the same as the original. If I turn it back on, and I'll disable that linear wipe just to show you, this is exactly the same as before we've applied either of these effects. But what I can do now is add any other effect between these two to make it look like it was baked into the footage. So if I go and say generate and add a grid effect and change the blending mode to normal so that it just overlays on top of the footage, I'll just change this to be width slider so I can make the grid a little bit bigger and the width of the border to be a little bit bigger as well. In fact, let's make that grid a lot bigger. And if I play this back, it actually looks like that grid was part of the footage. It's inheriting all of the camera movement that was being reverse stabilized and then unstabilized, basically. So hopefully this gets your wheels turning on how you might use this sandwiched approach to applying effects to footage without actually having to do much tracking. All right, I'm gonna get rid of that grid in the second instance and then take a look at the next objectives, which are apply motion to target and apply motion to target over original. And these are going to allow us to do the similar things, but to a separate layer. So I'm gonna go grab my logo, bring it into this comp, and actually just turn it off. Then I'll go back to Warp Stabilizer and change this to apply motion to target. And I need to choose my target layer. So that's the next option. I'm gonna choose my logo right there, and then play this back, and it immediately is adopting the camera movement that came from my original footage. Now, this is compositing it onto its own layer. So if I said duplicated this, I'll call this one logo, and I'll call this one footage. Then I could actually get rid of Warp Stabilizer on the original, and it looks like my logo is now in that footage. Now, there's not a whole lot that I can do to manipulate where that actually is. It's basically just putting it in the center of my scene, but that might be exactly what you want to do. So this can be viewed now as kind of a simple 3D camera tracker. Without having to do any complex selections and using actual 3D layers and 3D cameras, we're able to stick a 2D graphic into this scene and make it look like it was actually there. But this is actually more steps than I really need to take. If I get rid of that footage and I call this stabilized again, and I'll just delete this one so we don't have confusion there, I can change my objective to apply motion to target over original, and then it will just composite it right over top of that footage for me. No need to duplicate and separate those out. The benefit of having those separated layers is you can apply individual effects to the footage versus what's being composited into the shot. Now, if you did want to move this around a little bit, then what you could do is move the layer using an effect. If I move the layer around just by clicking and dragging or scaling it up and down, you see that's not doing anything to the composited version. But if I apply the transform effect to my logo, then I can use this effect to scale, position, and rotate the layer. All I need to do is under the target layer selection, make sure that effects and masks is enabled so that it accounts for that transform effect. Now I can scale it up or down. Don't need to see this anymore. I can move it around the frame, but this is still limited. I can only go so far beyond that frame before it starts to get cropped off. And unfortunately, there is no control for adjusting that cropping. Finally, we have show track points, and this is exactly the same as the 3D camera tracker. It's going to show you all of the points of the image that it is actually tracking throughout the shot to generate the stabilized footage. And we can control that track point size if you want to see it for some reason. And auto delete points across time is going to get rid of points that aren't visible after certain parts of the footage aren't visible anymore. So everything down here below my shelf, this side of the frame, I immediately get rid of those points. And when I pan up at the end, all those points that were visible before are just being removed. I can uncheck that and it will attempt to keep all of those points, but there's really no benefit to doing that. It's just going to increase the size of your project file and have more data to keep track of. Finally, we have hide warning banner. So if I reset this effect, it's going to start analyzing again, but I could hide that warning banner just by checking that box and then we won't see it anymore. But with that, we've covered all of these controls and we can move on to camera shake deblur. So I'm gonna let this analyze one more time so I have a nice smooth camera movement and then find a frame where there is camera shake. And it looks like right here is a great example. So this is my stabilized footage with that blur still baked in. It looks a little weird since the camera isn't really moving anymore, but we're still getting some camera shake. So that's exactly what Camera Shake Deblur is attempting to reduce. It doesn't really work on footage that wasn't stabilized because it's meant to remove this blur that shows up even though the camera appears to not be shaking anymore. I'm applying stabilization using the warp stabilizer, but if your camera was using stabilization, this type of blurring might show up baked into the footage. And Camera Shake Deblur can also help with that. So I'm going to bring Camera Shake Deblur out. It'll take a second to update, but just like that, it really cleans up the blur. It's not perfect. We still have a little bit of haloing, but compared to with it off, it actually makes a really big difference. So with these little camera bumps where we have that blur happening, let me zoom in real close so we can see that in real time. Right there, I'll just turn that back on and we'll play it back again. And as you can see, it does take longer to preview, but it's worth it because it's able to reduce that blurring. So there's still a little jitter right there, but it's far less drastic than with that effect off. And we do have some controls to modify how that looks. So again, I'm going to pause on this frame without and with, and let's look at the controls. We have blur duration. By default, it's set to 5 frames, but I could change this to 7 or 9. And this is just going to increase the amount of frames that the effect is analyzing on either side of this blur to pull information from and try and reconstruct a non-blurry image. So you can increase this if you think that it will help, but it's not making a huge difference with this particular shake since it was very quick. The next property is Deblur method, which is set to standard, but I could change this to high quality, and it's going to tell you this will take longer. It's a slower process. So I'll take a snapshot on this high quality, change it back to standard, and show you that it just does a more detailed analysis of that blur and produces less distortion. Next, we have strength. It's set to 100% by default, but I could turn that down if I don't want it to be quite as much, or I could crank this up all the way to 200, and it might produce something that looks better. Now, I think that looks a little bit better than at 100%, so I'm going to leave it up there. The last property is shake sensitivity, which is exactly what it sounds like. The higher this value, the more sensitive this effect will be to camera shake blur, and the lower it is, the less sensitive it will be. So only the most extreme blurs will be corrected. Now, this was a pretty intense camera shake, so that's why even at a low value of 4 or even 1, the effect is still trying to correct it because it really can tell that is definitely camera shake. But every clip is different, obviously, so you can play around with those values however you feel like you need to. That's it for Camera Shake Deblur. Now let's take a look at rolling shutter repair. I have another clip where I just quickly whipped my camera back and forth between this question mark block and the After Effects pillow. And if I pause right in here, you can see that distortion very quickly. I'm just going to bring out that rolling shutter repair effect, apply it to this clip, and immediately that distortion is accounted for. It's very fast. It does a really great job, and we have a handful of controls to customize this if we need it to be adjusted further. So I'm using this frame as my point of reference as to how that vertical line right there should be aligned. It's slightly to the left, so when the camera pans, I don't want it angling to the right like that. So I'm going to increase my rolling shutter rate to be higher. In fact, I might turn it all the way up to 100% so that that stays much more vertical. And I'll play this again, and that distortion is virtually eliminated. Now, your footage might not be as extreme as mine, so you play around with that rolling shutter rate to fit your needs. But we have some other controls to modify what's going on here. The scan direction allows you to control what direction that rolling shutter is actually happening in. Most typically, it's top to bottom because it's most noticeable when you're whip panning from side to side. But I could reverse this to bottom to top, and then it's actually going to increase the amount of rolling shutter because it's reversing that distortion and just exaggerating it even further. But maybe you're working with footage that was shot on a GoPro and maybe it was mounted upside down. This would be exactly why you'd want to reverse the scan direction. The same goes for left to right or right to left. It's going to change the orientation of that rolling shutter repair, which could be a result of the camera being mounted vertically in a portrait mode, so the footage comes in basically sideways. So scan direction allows you to account for any one of those directions. Then we have the advanced section. Method is set to warp, but we could change this to pixel motion. So where there was a lot of rolling shutter distortion, and I'll turn this all the way up to 100 again, and change it from warp to pixel motion. This is going to use pixel motion blur to attempt to reconstruct the frame. Now, in my experience, this just never looks all that great. You can see right here, my block has all kinds of artifacting in it. It's slower, so I've really never used this mode. The warp has always been sufficient for my needs, so I don't even suggest that you bother with this, but obviously you can use it if you think that it's producing a better result. We have pixel motion detail. The higher this number, the more detail it's going to put into attempting to reconstruct your image, but it does take longer, and higher values don't necessarily mean better results. Now, if I change this back to warp, detailed analysis is enabled, and if I check that on, it might take a little bit more time to render, although it's still much faster than the pixel motion option. And again, I'll stop on a frame where there was a lot of distortion and just show you the difference between standard and detailed analysis. And this is basically just an extra step you can take if you're not happy with a standard distortion removal. Most of the time though, the default settings do just fine. But with that, we've covered all of the properties for all three of these effects. They're all very useful for removing distortion from shaky footage, and they're really incredibly fast. So there's no reason for you not to use them. But that's everything you need to know about warp stabilizer, rolling shutter repair, and camera shake deblur. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, then check out the other ones here on my YouTube channel. And if you like my teaching style, then definitely check out my longer form content on Skillshare and School of Motion. And if you want to support more tutorials like this one, check out my Patreon. You can find links for all of that stuff in the description of this video.